The cold ocean water dripped from the thick black canvas onto the wooden deck of the boat. Mark stood frozen beneath the harsh halogen deck light, holding a pair of heavy shears. The air around him suddenly smelled like standing water from a long-forgotten cellar. Through the slit he had just cut in the wrapping, something wet and smooth reflected the yellow light. It was not a fish, and it was not marine debris. It was a perfectly preserved rubber diving suit, filled out from the inside as if someone were still standing within it. But when Mark reached out to feel for a pulse or a frame, the material yielded like water. And then, from deep inside the suit, a faint rhythmic vibration began. To understand why Mark sold his commercial fishing license 3 weeks later and never set foot on a boat again, we have to go back to that chilly November night. Mark had been working the waters off the coast of Maine for over 20 years. He knew every ledge, every drop-off, and every shift in the tide. He was a practical man who measured his life in gallons of diesel and pounds of catch. On that particular Tuesday, he was running his 80-foot trawler alone, about 12 miles off the jagged coastline. The ocean was flat and black as oil, covered in a thin layer of freezing sea fog that muted all sound. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the hydraulic winch began to whine under abnormal strain. Mark stepped out of the heated wheelhouse into the freezing night air, pulling his thick rubber gloves tight. The steel cable hummed with tension, vibrating violently against the stern roller. Something down in 80 fathoms of water had caught in his net. Normally, a snag meant a waterlogged pine trunk or a piece of discarded marine equipment. But as the winch slowly gathered line, the hull deck sensor showed the weight was completely motionless. It had not drifted with the deep current. It had been resting on the seabed, waiting to be pulled upward into the light. When the dragnet finally broke the pitch-black surface of the water, Mark shone his handheld spotlight over the stern. Cascading streams of seawater poured off a massive, oblong shape suspended in the heavy nylon mesh. It was roughly 7 feet long and tightly wrapped in layers of heavy industrial canvas, bound with thick blue polypropylene rope. The knots were neat, precise, and double-bound, executed with professional care. There were no barnacles attached to the fabric, no algae, no salt crust, and no tear marks from the rocks on the sea floor. Whatever had just come up from the bottom of the bay had not been down there for long. Mark swung the boom arm over the deck and lowered the heavy mass onto the wet wooden planks. The thud was solid and heavy, causing the entire deck to shudder under his boots. A dark, oily residue began to seep from the wet canvas, spreading toward the scuppers. It carried a strange, heavy odor that made Mark step back. It smelled like wet earth, crushed pine needles, and old iron. It did not smell like the ocean at all. Mark grabbed his heavy utility knife from his belt and approached the bundle. He squeezed the canvas. It felt dense and surprisingly cold, colder than the freezing water from which it had just been dragged. He sliced through the first layer of synthetic rope. The line parted with a sharp snap, uncoiling across the deck like a dead snake. Mark pulled back the stiff canvas folds, expecting to find smuggled cargo or discarded machinery. Instead, nestled inside 3 separate layers of waterproof wrapping, was a custom-built steel casing with brass latches. The metal was dull and gray, completely unmarred by rust or saltwater corrosion. Etched into the top plate of the casing was a set of geographic coordinates and a single name written in clear block lettering. It was the registered name of Mark's own fishing vessel, the Sea Venture, painted just as it appeared on his bow. His heart began to hammer against his ribs as he stared down at the metal box. He had bought the boat second-hand, 8 years prior, from an estate sale in Portland. He checked the hinges of the steel casing. They were greased and free of rust. Mark unclasped the 4 heavy brass latches one by one. Each latch popped open with a dry, mechanical click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet bay. He lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside lay a stack of clear, waterproof sleeves containing dozens of black and white photographs. Beneath the photographs sat a brass compass, 3 brass keys on a ring, and a heavy rubber suit folded neatly at the bottom. Mark pulled off his heavy gloves with trembling hands and lifted the top photograph from the stack. The image was crisp and clear. It showed his own boat, the Sea Venture, viewed from directly underneath the water, looking up toward the surface. The hull was clearly visible against the faint sunlight filtering down through the sea. Mark flipped to the second photograph. It was taken from the same underwater perspective, but closer to the stern. On the back of each print, A neat timestamp was stamped in red ink. The date spanned 3 consecutive years, with the final photograph stamped with the date of yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock. In that final photograph, the water was dark and murky. Looking up at the bottom of his boat, Mark could see the shadowy outline of something resting on his stern ladder, submerged up to its waist in the water. If you are enjoying this mysterious account, please take a quick second to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Mark stared at the red timestamp on the back of the print. Yesterday at 3 in the afternoon, he had been anchored 6 miles offshore eating his lunch in the wheelhouse. He had been completely alone, miles from any other vessel, in 80 feet of open, empty water. A sudden low hum echoed through the timber of the boat deck. Mark dropped the photograph onto the wet wood. The heavy steel casing was vibrating violently, sending small ripples through the puddle of dark oil around it. Simultaneously, the wheelhouse depth sounder began to beep wildly behind him. Mark rushed into the cabin to look at the glowing digital screen. The sonar beam showed a solid, massive return, sitting directly underneath his stationary hull. It was not moving with the tide. It was hovering exactly 10 feet below his keel, suspended in the black water, perfectly matching the speed and drift of his vessel. Panic seized Mark with a cold, absolute grip. He sprinted back out onto the deck, grabbed the heavy canvas wrappings, and shoved them violently into the steel casing. He slammed the heavy metal lid down and threw his weight against the brass latches, securing them back in place. Working with desperate speed, he rigged the boom hook to the steel box and hoisted it off the deck planks. He swung the boom out over the dark water and hit the quick-release lever. The heavy casing dropped into the black ocean with a loud, hollow splash that echoed into the freezing fog. Mark stared over the gunwale into the pitch-black water. On his depth sounder, he watched the glowing icon of the box sink rapidly toward the ocean floor. It dropped past 30 fathoms, then 50, then 70. But at 75 fathoms, just above the seabed, the descent stopped entirely. The icon remained motionless on the screen for 3 long minutes. Then, slowly and methodically, the target on the screen began to ascend again toward the surface. Mark did not wait to see it break the water. He cut the anchor line, slammed the engine throttle fully forward, and raced back toward Blackwood Harbor at full speed. The Coast Guard investigated Mark's report the following morning, sending a dive team out to the coordinates he provided. They found nothing on the seabed. No steel casing, no canvas wrappings, and no record of any underwater equipment registered in that zone. Official records confirmed that no dives had been authorized in those waters for over 5 years. The unanswered questions continued to haunt Mark every single day. Who was taking those underwater photographs of his hull for 3 years? How did his boat name end up stamped on a container submerged in 80 fathoms of water? And what was waiting beneath his stern ladder while he ate his lunch? Today, Mark lives over 50 miles inland in a small rural town, far from the sound of the ocean waves. He never goes near the water, refusing even to visit coastal towns or cross large bridges at night. Whenever he hears the distant sound of wet fabric dragging across wood, he freezes where he stands. If you have ever pulled up something strange from the dark depths or experienced an encounter that cannot be explained, please share your account in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe for more dark, allegedly true stories from the forgotten corners of the world.